Hi, everybody. Erev Tov. It's good to have you all here. We're really excited for this series, Sinai Bound and Torah Bound. We're just letting everyone get settled and welcomed in. So just give a moment or two for people to take a deep breath and settle into the moment. And we're really excited not only for tonight's teaching, but also the series that's going through the counting of the Omer. We're in this week of Gvura, this week of discipline and judgment and the exercise of that, and hoping everyone is finding their way in this balance of it all. So welcome. I'm Rabbi Felicia Saul. I know a good number of you here. And we're really happy, along with Cantor Dave Mintz and Roli and Becca and Shuli, to offer this series, which is really part of a larger picture around the walk from Pesach to Shavuot, which we mark through the counting of the Omer, recognizing that freedom is not an end in of itself. It's towards a purpose of service and receiving of Torah and being in relationship with God, of purposefulness and connectedness. It's traditional to study Pirkei Avot during this season. And we are doing a very particular study of Pirkei Avot this year, besides learning at the Minyan on a daily basis between Mincha and Mariv. Our learning of Pirkei Avot this year is going to focus on 1 week per chapter, so beginning the 6 chapters, and we're beginning this week with chapter 1, with like a highlight on one particular Mishnah, one Torah of Pirkei Avot. And the one this evening is a familiar one that Rabbi Lauren Tuchman will open up for folks. And then we're diving into the question of questions for our community about how we actually as a community can build a covenant through the teachings of Pirkei Avot and through our reflections about what are our commitments to one another and what is the essence of obligation in community? What do we owe to our individual self and what are obligations to one another? How is Torah centered in the community? And as we pass week to week with a focus on each chapter and one particular Mishnah of Pirkei Avot, we're going to have the opportunity on our interactive website, a platform that Dave Mintz is going to post in the chat, where we can, as community members, only BJ members, to weigh in on these very questions, either through writing or through actually video or through audio. So it's multi-access and multi-connectivity, and whichever mode is the right mode for you. We really want to say, not only do we want to learn together and study together and grow in our individual path on this walk from Pesach to Shavuot, but we collectively want to generate a conversation that will produce, through our own reflections, a community covenant, which we hope to reveal around the time of the High Holy Days. So we're really happy, once again, to launch this series with Rabbi Lauren Tuchman. Lauren and I have had the opportunity to hang out together a number of times. We were on a panel together at the end of March, celebrating 50 years of women in the rabbinate, and which was really beautiful. And we were really pleased that Lauren agreed to launch this series tonight. Rabbi Lauren Tuchman is a sought-after speaker, spiritual leader, and educator. She was ordained in the Jewish Theological Seminary in 2018. She is, as far as she is aware, as far as I'm aware too, but you're the one who knows more about this, the first blind woman in the world to enter the rabbinate. She provides consulting to individuals and organizations across the Jewish community on a variety of matters pertinent to disability, access, and inclusion. She has taught in numerous synagogues and other organizations across North America. She was named to the Jewish Week's 36 Under 36 for her innovative leadership concerning inclusion of Jews with disabilities in all aspects of Jewish life. In 2017, she delivered an ELI Talk, which is the Jewish version of TED Talks, an ELI Talk entitled "We All Were at Sinai," The Transformative Power of Inclusive Torah. And she is a participant in the Institute for Jewish Spirituality's Clergy Leadership Program. So we're really, besides the incredible work that Lauren has done in the world, we're really honored. I feel honored to introduce her tonight and to have, and I also want to say she's a member of BJ during the pandemic. She used to come to BJ here or there when she was at JTS, but we're really honored that you've been a part of our community and now get to teach your own community here tonight. So Brucha Haba, welcome to the Zoom room. And I apologize, I have to run to another event, but I really wanted to be here to introduce Lauren.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Sol, for that beautiful introduction, and good luck with your next event. And thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here with all of you tonight, and truly honored to open this series on Pirkei Avot. So this is going to be partially, I'm going to start with a brief intro. What is Pirkei Avot? And then we're going to jump right into the Mishnah that we're focusing on tonight, which I imagine is pretty familiar to a lot of you. Great, so what is Pirkei Avot? So we're in the time of Sfirat HaOmer, and as Rabbi Sol said, this is the week of Gevurah, the week of discipline, the week of steadfastness, boundaries, all of these things. We're creating a container for the chesed, and we're working with the 7 lower sfirot of the tree of life, and that is as much Kabbalah as you'll get tonight from me. I am not very Kabbalistically oriented myself, but I think that there's something really beautiful about the ways in which these lower sfirot, which can also be understood as midot, as character traits, are talked about in the Omer period and related to each day of the Omer. So Pirkei Avot is a tractate of Mishnah. Mishnah is oral law, but you'll notice if you study Pirkei Avot that Pirkei Avot is more of a guide to ethics and a guide to behavior. Some of the Mishnayot in this compilation, unsurprisingly, are challenging for folks who are modern, those of us who are modern readers and those of us who are liberal modern readers of text. There are some things in Pirkei Avot that can be challenging, but overwhelmingly, Pirkei Avot is this beautiful guide to how to show up in the world. And the rabbis put this together, and it's part of the Mishnah, and there's 6 chapters, and we will study 1 parak a week, 1 chapter a week. And this is a traditional custom that communities across the Jewish spectrum adopted for the Shabbatot between Pesach and Shavuot. 1 parak a week. It's often studied on Shabbat. It's also, of course, studied during the week, and it really guides us through these weeks of counting. And the Mishnah is derived from the root to repeat or to teach, shin nun yud, to repeat or to teach. And it was compiled in the land of Israel in the 2nd century of the Common Era. So let me pause and say, what did I mean when I just said Common Era? I don't expect that folks are familiar with that term. So because the calendar that we use in a civil way, meaning the New Year's on January 1st and Thanksgiving is in November, all these things, right? All of these markers of time in the general society are based on the Western Gregorian Christian calendar, which divides itself into 2 broad categories, of course, BC, before Christ, and AD, out of meaning, which is, I believe, having to do with the year of our Lord, is the translation into English. As Jews, that is not theologically relevant for us, right? So when we are referring to years using this calendrical system, we use the terms before the Common Era to refer to the quote BC, unquote, period, and the word Common Era to refer to the AD period. This is also a convention that's been adopted in academic circles as well. So roughly around the year 200 of the Common Era in the land of Israel, and mostly in the Galil in the north, the Mishnah was compiled. The Mishnah is the oral law, and the Talmud, both of them, the Talmud Yerushalmi and the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud, both of them are built upon and comment upon the Mishnah. The Mishnah is pretty terse in terms of its content. Each tractate of Mishnah is relatively short, but there's quite a lot in that amount of content. And we learn that there is a program also. You might be familiar with a lot of daily learning programs. There is a Mishnah Yomi program where people will learn Mishnah every day. And then, of course, if you're doing Daf Yomi, or like me trying to do Daf Yomi, you encounter the Mishnayot in the context of the Gemara. And I want to pause and go back because I realized I forgot to say something very important at the very top, which is that I am not able to monitor the chat when I'm teaching. So please do feel free to put questions or comments into the chat, and Dave will moderate those in a little bit. If there is anything technically urgent, he will let me know. So please do feel free to use the chat, but know that I am not monitoring it as I'm teaching. So Pirkei Avot being divided into 6 chapters is also quite interesting because there's a debate as to whether or not the first 5 are the original Pirkei Avot, and then the 6th chapter, which is really all about acquiring Torah, was a later addition. But nevertheless, these 6 chapters are in the Mishnah, and they are at the end of an order or a seder, which we all recognize that from a few weeks ago. But the word seder actually refers to order, and the Mishnah is divided into 6 sedarim, into 6 orders, and each order or each large section has multiple subsections within it. And interestingly, Pirkei Avot is at the very end of Seder Nezikin, which is about damages and tort law. So I think that is also something to think about. What does it mean that this compilation of ethical teachings is found at the end of a long section that has to do with civil law? And our opening chapter, which we're now going to be looking at, so I will invite you, Dave, to share screen. The opening chapter really talks about the chain of transmission, because it's very, very important for the rabbis to situate themselves as the authentic transmitters of Torah. And how do they do that? They do that by starting from the very get-go. And they talk about who received Torah from whom, teacher to student, teacher to student, teacher to student, and situate themselves in that lineage. And we know in rabbinic literature, it is very, very important to let folks know from where you learned a particular teaching. We call it B'Shem Amro or B'Shem Amra. We say that in the name of our teacher. We say it in the name of the one who spoke it. And this is often recounted both in the Mishnah and in the Gemara and in rabbinic literature in general. And it's a really beautiful practice, I think, to root ourselves in authentic lineage, and even more significantly than that, to remember who we learned our Torah from. And when I use the word Torah, I want to be very clear. I'm coming at this from the perspective of a broad, multivocal interest where our tradition, which has been largely handed over and inherited through rabbinic texts, which were written by men and had men in mind as their audience. And I want to live in a Jewish world where that text is sacred and important, and we continue to learn from it. And we also broaden our bookshelf to learn from Jews of all genders. So when we talk about this notion of stating who we learned our Torah from, not only does it lift up the name of the person, but it also really gives credit to where credit is due. So that is an important segue for where we're about to go. And we're looking at Pirkei Avot. In your numbering, it should be chapter 1, Mishnah 15. And this is in a series of Mishnayot that are recordings of the statements of Hillel. And Hillel, of course, is one of the most important of our teachers. We, of course, have Hillel and Shammai, who were both actual people and who founded their own schools of Talmudic and Jewish law conversation and disputants and creation of halakha. So we know we as a Jewish community to this day mostly follow the rulings of Hillel. Hillel is considered to be more gentle than Shammai. Hillel is considered to be far more makil, far more lenient than Shammai. Shammai is understood as to be quite strict. And generally speaking, Hillel and Shammai, one of the interesting things that the Talmud says about them is that when they would give over, one of the reasons that we follow Hillel is because unlike Shammai, Hillel would give over Shammai's ruling before giving over their own. And I'm saying there because Hillel often refers to a school, though Hillel can, of course, refer to the individual himself. So Hillel as the school often refers to the students, but in this context, I'm pretty confident we're talking about Hillel the man, Hillel the individual. So in this sequence of Mishnayot, one of the interesting things to mention also is that often in Pirkei Avot, things are done in threes. Why are things done in threes? Because this is an oral text originally. This entire tradition was originally completely oral. The only reason it was written down and compiled was because people were afraid it would be forgotten from Israel, from the people Israel, and therefore the rabbis felt it was extraordinarily important to make sure it was written down. But originally, when you learned Mishnah, the root of the word Mishnah being Shin Nun Yud, that has to do with repetition. You would actually go to your teacher and you would learn by ear and you would repeat by ear. And even though there were folks who were literate, of course, and could read and write, nevertheless, this was a fully oral tradition for many, many centuries. So when it's presented to us, it's presented in a way that it's easy for us to remember. We tend, for some reason that I am not an expert in, apparently human beings, we tend to be really good at remembering things in threes. If anyone can lend some insight into that later on in the evening, that would be really interesting. But just as a stylistic and literary note, that is probably why it's designed that way. So we're going to move into this Mishnah, and I'm going to, instead of reading the whole thing, I'm actually going to go clause by clause, and I'm going to break it down and give my translation of this, which might differ a little bit from what's on the screen. Part of why I'm doing this is I don't assume any background, any particular level of Hebrew textual background, and we're not here to do a deep skill building textual analysis. And I want to, though, give over a little bit of linguistic content that I think is really significant to understanding this Mishnah. So we have here multiple clauses of the Mishnah, and I'm going to begin by reading the first one. Hu haya omer. So this is important. He, meaning Hillel, who, the pronoun here, he, haya. This is a past tense word, and why is that important here? Because this is showing that this text is recording something that Hillel would say. So it's as if to say Hillel was used to saying, or we often heard this thing from Hillel. Open quote, and Omer, meaning that he would say. So we often would hear this thing that he would say. Im ein ani li. Mili. All right, so we're going to pause here. Our first question. If ein ani, im ein ani, if I am not li, for myself or to myself, mili, who am I? First question that Hillel asks, if I'm not for myself, who am I? Meaning if I don't stand up for my own well-being and take care of my own needs, who am I? Sha'ani la'atzmi ma'ani. And if I'm only for myself or to myself, well then what am I? So there's a really interesting question here. We're having different questions. Who am I and what am I? And then finally, ve'im lo achshav ematai. And if not now, when? And this is one of those Mishnayot, this is one of those Mishnahs that we hear so frequently in songs and general Jewish ethics, in social justice work, etc. That sometimes I think we take it a little bit for granted and we're like, oh, yeah, that's a very famous threefold saying of Hillel. All right, that's nice, that's lovely. Okay, I can totally go with that. But let's actually break it down for a second. And we're only going to be using this text. We're not going to be using other commentary because I want folks to really dig into this. As we're saying in the community, we have the journal and all these ways of connecting. So I really want us to start thinking for ourselves, what does this actually mean? Okay, so Hillel would say these three things. So if I am not for myself, who am I? If I only am thinking about others, or if I don't stand up for my own well-being, or I don't engage in self-advocacy, who am I? Put another way, this is a really contemporary question, I think, for a lot of us in this room. So often, I think that we often deprioritize our own needs. And I think it comes from actually a really well-intended place. Because many of us in this country right now live deeply privileged lives. And because of that, a lot of us really want to do the good, noble, and necessary work of allyship, right? And of working alongside others to build a better world for us all. And so sometimes in that work, we aren't often thinking about our own needs, or we minimize them, or anything we experience in terms of the oppressed groups that we are a part of, we may not necessarily prioritize as much because we are focusing on other issues or because we think it's less important. But Hillel is really challenging us here, right? Certainly challenging me. If I am not for myself, who am I? If I'm not my own best advocate, well, then who am I in this work? And that's a challenge I think we can all sit with, especially in this week of Gevurah, where we're talking a lot about issues of boundaries, discipline, strength, power, and thinking about the container that we can build for our spiritual work this week. All of those lovely intentions we set around chesed and how do we act with a lot of chesed in the world, those are great. How do we actually actualize them in the world as it is? And part of that is figuring out how we actually show up for ourselves. Because if we don't show up for ourselves, and I think this is true, particularly for those of us who were socialized not to show up for ourselves, which tends to map in different ways, but I think is something that we all can really relate to, then we're not actually showing up for other people. And if we don't have responsibility, if we don't feel a sense of responsibility for ourselves and for our own well-being, then how do we actually show up in covenant and in connection with other people? And also related to that, if we aren't filling our cups, then how are we supposed to be of service in the world? I think this is a critically important question for us to be thinking about. So we hold that, and again, we've got these three questions here, but they're all deeply connected. And so I'm going to continue with the second piece of this. Shani, that's me, ma'ani. So here's the exact opposite of this. If I'm only for myself, what am I? Not even who am I, what am I? If my only concern is my own well-being, what am I? And I know in these past couple of years, this is a particular challenge for many of us, certainly for me. I can't speak for anyone else, but I can say that absolutely for me, this has been a significant challenge. Because on the one hand, we can think about the world as one that is deeply unequal and in need of a lot of tikkun, a lot of repair. And it's really easy, I have found personally in my own experience, it is extraordinarily easy to fall into a pattern of being so consumed with your own needs and your own safety that you neglect that of others. So Hillel is asking us to really take a middle ground here, a middle pathway between not being exclusively for myself, but also not being not for myself. I'm sorry for the double negative there, right? Hillel is asking us to find that equilibrium between saying, if I am only for myself, what am I? But if I'm not for myself, then that's as much of a problem. If I can't be completely self-obsessed, because that's a problem. Who am I? What am I? I've taken myself out of this conversation. But if I am not for myself at all, well, then I've also completely taken myself out of this conversation. And so the moral and the spiritual challenge that is being presented to us in this moment is to figure out how we actually find that middle ground. And I don't think that that answer is easy for any of us. I do think it is very different for all of us. I do not believe that there is a single way to answer this question. And that's one of the beautiful things about this Mishnah, that there is not one way, because every single one of us on this call and every single one of us watching later has experienced the world in very different ways and has a lot of particular personal dimensions that they have to consider, and many things that, frankly, lots of us just are completely unaware of everything that people are carrying. At the same time, some of us are truly and honestly, not even from just a rhetorical perspective, but from an actual resource perspective, we are profoundly disadvantaged. And so in that case, the question is a little bit different. We still ask, or we still say, if I am only for myself, what am I? But we also have to think about, okay, maybe I have to be a little bit more for myself. Maybe I don't have as much bandwidth to be thinking about doing work with others or however that may land. And I'm going to give an example of that, right? There are a lot of folks in our world still who, for whom the pandemic, a lot of us, I think there are many of us who live now in a reality or are beginning to live in a reality, right? That tells us that we're in a different place with COVID. And this is not the place to we're not going to get into a conversation about this. I'm simply using this as an example. We get into a place where we tend to think that because of our own personal circumstances, because we're vaccinated and we're boosted and we've taken that social responsibility to be vaccinated and boosted, right? Or we've been very COVID cautious. We wear masks, the proper masks, whenever we need to, whatever it is we're doing, that we're living in a different reality now, and we can go about our daily lives as normal, and we can start to have more gatherings. And what a blessing that is for those of us able to do that. And what a tremendous gift to be able to come back with people. And that is also in the world at the same time as there are people in our community and elsewhere who are still at extraordinary risk for COVID, and for whom the actions that we all take make that risk perhaps even greater. So the question that we sit with, and this I think is a real moral challenge that we're not going to solve tonight, but I'm using it simply as a very strident example of it. But I think this was one of the questions that Hillel is asking of us to be thinking about. How do we balance our own individual needs, our own relationships with the people in our circles, with the needs, the social responsibility that we have towards our society? And how do we figure out a way to do so that is aligned with these first two questions, right? With Hillel saying, Im ein ani li mi li, if I am not for myself, if I am not caring for my own needs and not taking those seriously, who am I? If I'm totally being self-referential and putting myself last, what if I've lost something pretty tremendous? And at the same time, if I'm only for myself, what am I? If I'm not thinking about other people at all, what am I? If I'm totally self-indulged, what am I? Right? And so often we live in a world where looking out for me is the priority, not thinking about who is in relationship with me, who do I have responsibility for? That's what we're trying to do during these weeks of counting the Omer. Who do I have responsibility for? And how do we navigate that in a way that is deeply authentic and ethical and integral? This is the moral challenge our Mishnah is presenting to us. And it could be like the dugma, like the example I gave, it could be about COVID. It could be about an interpersonal situation in your family. It could be about anything. It could be about global events. There's so many ways in which this text is so deeply resonant. And I would be remiss if we don't talk about the final clause, Ve'im lo achshav ematai. And if not now, when? So this is one of those questions, of course, that ends our Mishnah that has been interpreted in numerous ways. And perhaps if we think about it in the way that I'm suggesting we think about it tonight, if we're not taking these questions on about covenant and kinship and responsibility and how we relate to one another, if we're not doing that now, when are we going to do it? If we put it off and put it off and put it off, then when are we ever going to take it on? When are we going to take on that ethical mantle? Not because we think we can come up with the best answer tomorrow and that solves everything and we're done and we've gotten into a self-righteous place. I think a lot of us can do that. I know I personally can find myself in a very self-righteous place where I think that I have all the answers and I know the right way and da-da-da-da-da. And I'm very sure of that often. But how do we actually grapple with this? And how do we remove some of that self-righteousness, which really is deep deen or judgment? And deen is very connected to gevurah, very connected to the stringency that we're thinking about this week. How do we move out of that place? And how do we, for the benefit of our own souls and for the benefit of everyone else that we actually interface with every day, how do we actually show up in a way that is far more generous of spirit, but is no less committed to our own ideals? Those two things do not have to be in conflict. And I think that that's another way that we can understand this Mishnah. That when the way that I perceive the world, the way that I go throughout the world, is not in any way in conflict with holding an ability to have multiple perspectives presented, even and especially when I particularly hold one way or another. Our tradition is one of great debate and really asks us to think independently, to question, to think for ourselves, and to take personal responsibility for how we think and for the conclusions we draw. And so this more open-ended Mishnah is allowing us, is inviting us into that conversation, particularly because Hillel was known as such a gentle and ethical teacher of Torah that in so many ways, Hillel is held up as really just the paradigm of that. And as we think about these things, I want to shift in a moment to conversation because I want to have some really spacious time to talk about this Mishnah, to think about how we relate to this in the context, keeping this on topic of the context that we're learning this in, which is both the Torah-bound context and also thinking about the way in which we are connected to one another and what our responsibilities are towards one another. And in that vein, as we move into more of an interactive portion, I'm going to invite folks to either write in the chat, and Dave will read those aloud, and I'll take a few questions at a time. Or if you do want to speak verbally, please raise your hand, and Dave will call on you as appropriate. So I'm just going to give a moment for questions to be brought in, and then we will go from there.
People may still be sitting with some of these ideas, but we'll give another minute for any questions or thoughts in the chat.
Miriam.
This has been a defining Mishnah of my life. I have loved this for years. I had it inscribed by a friend who's a calligrapher many, many years ago, when way before I knew that it was a Mishnah from Pirkei Avot. I absolutely love it for a number of reasons. One, because I totally believe in what he says, in that you have to have a belief in yourself and a caring for yourself before you can take care of anyone else. My entire professional life has been taking care of others. Most of my professional life, I wouldn't say my entire. As a social worker, as a chaplain, as a rabbi. And a lot of the conversation during these years has been self-care and taking care of myself, and the whole thing about putting the oxygen mask on myself or on ourselves before we can help anyone else. Because if we don't take care of ourselves, we can't be okay to take care of anyone else. And I just adore this, and I'm glad we're making this the first piece of study for tonight. And Linda, it's wonderful to see you. I can't help but say that. Hi. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, this is just such a beautiful Mishnah, and I cannot agree with you more about the importance of caring for oneself before we can care for others, or as you so beautifully put it, so that we can, in fact, care for others.
Right. Lauren, there's a question in the chat from Lori Spear, who asks, why were these two pieces, Hillel and Shammai's? I think Lori's talking about the Mishnah immediately following this. Why were they put in juxtaposition?
That is such a good question, Laurie. And the truth is, I'm not sure. It might have been thematic. It might also just have been the way that they were compiled. So I don't quite know why they were juxtaposed, but I know that there are probably many drushot about that. And I think that's a really key and important question to raise. So I wish I had a better answer than that, but I really appreciate the question.
And Fran and Warren have their hands up. You can unmute.
Okay, this is Warren. I have a formulation that I think dovetails with this, which is that Adonai blesses those who help themselves when they're able to do something. That Adonai blesses those who seek help from others when they're not able to do something, and that Adonai blesses those who helps others who are not able to do something that they're able to do. And that comes together to suggest that it takes community for Adonai to be fully present in her creation.
Thank you, Warren, for that. I think absolutely that this is pointing to our interdependence as a species, and that is what God self wants from us. And that I think that there is something really key and important to what you're saying. And I just want to appreciate it and thank you very much for sharing that.
And there's a comment from Tony Siegel in the chat that that your translation of this first section seems quite different in substance from the written one from Sepharia, which perhaps seems more common. She goes on to say your interpretation is more internal. The other seems to depend on interaction. Perhaps you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I think it's a gam v'gam. I think it's a both and. I believe that this Mishnah, just like with Torah in general, has 70 faces, meaning there are many ways of interpreting. And I do tend to think about text much more internally. That tends to be where I go naturally. However, that being said, I think you're absolutely correct to point out that in fact, this can be understood. And you're right that my translation is a bit different than the common one, because I do believe that this can be understood both as an internal process and as a deeply external process. And that in fact, we need both of them. We don't only need one, we actually need both for us to be able to function both as a person in the world and as a person part of a larger social structure.
And one last comment, that so many of us are in what are framed as helping professions. And this person wonders how you and others put this balance into practice and into life, and how we blend the individual and the societal work. Just an easy question for you.
Very wonderful question, very easy question. There are certain things that, I'm certainly a constant work in progress, and I do not claim to have any answers, only things that I've tried. And I know that many folks in this room right now have a lot of wisdom on this that they can offer as well. So I would say that I try often more successfully in theory than in practice, but I try to be thinking a lot about my digital usage, which of course in the last 2 years has, been off the charts, right? But how do we have a fence around that? How do we make sure that we are taking in content that keeps us both informed as citizens and as people, and also allows us to continue doing the work we're doing without depletion? I think also knowing what our limits are, knowing what we can and cannot do in terms of taking things on. I think in terms of who do we spend time with, either virtually or in person, thinking about the ways in which people that we surround ourselves with can have an effect upon us, and really just thinking about what is my piece of the larger social puzzle to do? What is my role? How do I show up in a right-sized way? So how do I actually show up in my work in a way that is aligned with the best that I can bring, and is a way that is aligned with the role that I can play? And what that often means is that we cannot do everything. We can do some things, and other people can do other things. We are all limited by virtue of the fact that we are human beings, and the infinite is infinite. The infinite divine is infinite, but we are finite human beings. So we need to discern how we use our time, how we think about the conversations we get involved in, the issues we get involved in. These are all deeply complicated questions with no easy answers, but there are things that we can spend time discerning to help us arrive at what might be a helpful starting point.
Great. And Bernie, I saw your hand up before.
Yeah, I did. Just an observation. I've always been impressed with all my studies how often things go back to Genesis, even to Kun Olam. Creation is still going on. And as Lauren was speaking, an image popped into my mind. This question goes way, way back when Cain said, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And the answer obviously was yes, because he was punished for his deed.
I love that, Bernie. Yes, this goes way back. And I was thinking about that as well, actually, as I was preparing. This goes way back to that very fundamental story of Cain and Hevel, right? And when Cain is asked, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And he's like, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Well, of course, as you said, obviously so. We are, in fact, responsible for one another. And there's an idea even that gets mentioned in several places in the liturgy. Kol Yisrael Aravim Zeh Lazeh. All of Israel are responsible or in fellowship, Chavirim Zeh Lazeh, meaning in connection. So folks can push back on that and say, well, Kol Yisrael are responsible for one another. Well, okay, so what does that exactly mean, right? Is this referring to the Jewish people only? Is this referring to our connection to human beings in general? And I believe that, in fact, we are responsible for everyone in our circle of care. And that's what gets back to the question, am I my brother's keeper? And I think that that is a very important question, because when we think about, if I'm only for myself, what am I? If I have no circle of care, well, then what am I? And if I'm not for myself, who am I? Who am I if I am not responsible to myself and to my own people and whatever we define by people, right? It could be our family, could be our country, could be the world, the Jewish people, our friends, co-workers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But being in that kind of relationship is so important, having that circle of care. And I think that ultimately that's something that we are experiencing in, perhaps one of the starkest ways that we've ever experienced it, the breaking down of that sense of having a circle of care and concern. That we do have that social responsibility for one another. And I think that that's something that Hillel is really inviting us to remember.
We'll take another minute for thoughts or questions in the chat.
Let's just pause.
We have a hand up from Sandy Coy.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just wondering about in pondering yourself and others, how is there implied in this or somehow that we should push ourselves a little bit about our self-image? I'm thinking of white supremacy,
Mm-hmm.
where, as like they say, you're a fish in water, you don't, and somebody says to the fish, "What's water?" What do you think of water? And the fish says, "What water?" And it's like that with white supremacy. Thinking, how does one apply this to getting past these very deep and broad blinding assumptions and understandings, to understand ourselves and others in a fresh way? Not to say that we're going to overdo it, I'm doing more than I can, or I'm putting myself last, or that kind of thing. I'm saying actually break through an image and a way of being that may not be healthy, but we didn't realize it.
Yeah, I think that that is a really key question, because the example you bring of white supremacy is so baked into the foundations of the United States, and many of us pass as white, and therefore we have benefited tremendously from this foundational assumption that we didn't even recognize because it is so pervasive.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that there is what to be said about pushing ourselves to recognize it. It's sort of like, I think about it as a mindfulness practice, right? When we're doing mindfulness practice, folks who are familiar with that, one of the things that we can do with that work is think about the emotions that we experience. And when we notice an emotion or a feeling arise, thinking about how we actually navigate that. Right? So if I'm feeling a sense of frustration arise, or I'm feeling a sense of tightness arise, I can either go with what I want to do initially and react fiercely to it, or I can take a moment of pausing and actually go inward and say, I'm noticing this. Okay. And it's not enough to just notice it. What am I going to do internally and externally in response to that noticing? And often we have to think about that. And I think that that's a way to think about, as individuals and as groups, thinking about our part in alleviating the world of white supremacy. Because part of what we have to do is push ourselves there. And it's hard when assumptions are so assumed and are so foundational and baked in. But I think that there is what to say. Let's push ourselves to both be for ourselves and simultaneously, as Hillel is saying, to be for others, to really push ourselves and to do so in a way that's actually going to cause us to show up to do the work of alleviating the world of white supremacy, rather than pushing ourselves so hard that we think it's hopeless and we end up just sitting on our laurels and not doing anything at all. And I've experienced plenty of that on my own self, where if you're like, oh, the world is so broken and there's just no point, well, then you don't show up, because it's like, well, everything is going to hell in a handbasket anyway.
Yeah, I just want to say just one little follow up on that. When you were talking about when something strikes you as you're thinking, and how do you react to that, and noticing. And I have to say that when I was starting out with trying to understand this racial reckoning, I didn't know what people were talking about when they said, when did you first realize that you were benefiting from white supremacy? And I thought, I have no idea what they're talking about. But gradually, I did notice when I was thinking that something came along and a little voice was telling me in my, but it was so nasty and so embarrassing that I couldn't even admit it to myself. It's all stereotypes and I don't know, just a cultural pervasiveness that is this little tape that's going through your head that you don't want to recognize consciously, but it's actually there. Mm-hmm. And that noticing that made me was a little bit of a shock to realize that actually was going on in my head, even if I didn't want it to be there or hadn't really noticed it before. It must be part of me and it must be influencing me somehow. And so I have to say that I did experience that shock that you're talking about, and how to deal with it, not to be too discouraged, but not to ignore it either. I think it really is an important lesson that you can apply from this Mishnah to that process, I think.
Yeah, and I think also something I'd add to that is that often that nasty tape that plays in our head, right, of all of the things that we have acculturated and socialized because of who we are, where we are, right? That tape that plays in our head that we're so embarrassed, we're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I thought that. Sometimes it's so embarrassing to acknowledge that we just want to push it away.
Yeah.
And we want to pretend like it doesn't exist, and we don't want to confront it, so we continue to avoid. And all that does is create more separation, right? All that does is go back into, if I'm only for myself, what am I? Because then I become all for myself because I'm too embarrassed and I don't want to deal with it and yada, yada, yada. So it's easier for me to just be for myself. And so I think that part of the work of this Mishnah is to think about, okay, I've got that really nasty dialogue. Some of it is like directed at me, like personally, like that really nasty inner critic voice. And some of it is like all of the stuff that I would say and all of the comments that I would make and all the things that it's like, oh my God, I can't believe I would say that thing, right? And I think that the work, one of the things that I love about our tradition is that we have this idea of tshuva that is not repentance, right? We don't repent during the high holidays. That's not a very, I'll put it in a more positive way. I was going to put it negatively. That is not a very Jewish way to understand what is tshuva. This is my particular perspective. It's not that we are repenting. We are turning towards another pathway. So it doesn't have that deed. It's like, oh no. So I'll put it in this way. Maybe like if I said, oh no, I totally used to have that stereotypical idea. Oh God, why did I grow up with that? Okay, well, it's not my individual fault. I was part of a larger system and the messaging in that system was particular, but I really don't want to continue that. I want to make a change. I want to do tshuva and I want to act and show up in a different way. So let me figure out, okay, I'm going to notice this thing happening, but I'm going to make an actual choice. I'm at a choice point here, as the Musar masters say. I'm at a choice point and I am going to choose to do a different thing in response to this thing that I'm hearing in my head. Because it's sort of like, I think about oppression like racism and ableism and sexism, right, as they're so baked in that it's kind of like you undo these feelings, and then it's kind of like a rainstorm. It's like being in a perpetual rainstorm, right? Like you're talking about a fish in water and the fish asking, well, what is the water? And that is often how this works, right? It is so baked into our cultural assumptions. I mean, turn on any kind of media and it's right there. It's just right there, right? And it's so present that you kind of can't help but assimilate it because it's there. It's like in the water, literally, like, or maybe metaphorically, but it's omnipresent. So the tshuva work is to notice that and be like, oh, it's here. That thing again is showing up. I don't want that thing, but it's here. I'm not going to resist that it's here because resisting is not helpful. I'm going to notice and acknowledge, and then I'm going to choose to act differently. And I think that's the key. That's where I think a lot of us make the wrong turn in this work because we don't want it so badly. We want to be thought of as good people, and we all are good people. We live in a world that tells us all of these negative things. So rather than resisting, like, oh, I shouldn't think that, like, you know what? I really wish I wasn't thinking that thing. It's not great. I don't want to be in that place. This thing happened. What am I going to do to make sure it happens less and less frequently until it goes away entirely? I think that is far more gentle and much better in terms of actually then being an ally, right? Because the point of being an ally isn't to get any brownie points. The point of being an ally is to really stand alongside folks and build a better world. So I know that was quite long. I'm sorry, Sandy, but you had such a great question. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right, do we have any other questions or comments? We've got a little bit of time.
Yes, Stephen and Nilda.
Rabbi, I think what you just mentioned is, not pushing away those feelings that come or those thoughts that pop up in your head, because when you push them away, it does get in the way of actually going forward and following that path. But also when you're in a community and you have that thought, feeling safe within your community to say, this is probably a wrong thought, or maybe an impolite thought to think, but I want to discuss this with my community, and having the safety of the community to be able to say, work with me so I can understand how I'm making somebody else feel uncomfortable, or maybe not saying the right thing at the right time, or saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. I think that's the bigger part of being in a part of community, and sort of realizing how my needs and the thoughts that pop into my head are contrary to my community, or they're actually in my community and my community is afraid to talk about them.
I am so glad you brought that up, because that also is part of the moral challenges that we are sitting with. And I think that this Mishnah can do a lot of guidance for, right? If not now, when, right? How do we really get into these questions that a lot of us hold, and do so in a way that is emotionally intelligent and respectful and productive? So to your question around community, there are lots of ways to navigate that question. One of the things that I think is really successful, and is something that I encourage all of us to do, is think something called identity caucusing, which is not a great term for it, but basically it's finding groups of folks that are pretty similar in terms of social position, meaning like as a white Ashkenazi Jew, for example, if I want to think about white supremacy and how it affects me as a white Ashkenazi Jew, then I can get into a group with other white Ashkenazi Jews and we can sit around and have that conversation, right? Think about like, okay, so how does this affect us in our particular social position, right? And then we can ask questions in a way that is moving towards solution and moving towards building a world that we are all able to show up as our full selves, and in a way that is education for action, right? Because what I often say to people is that you can only educate someone on an issue who really is invested. You know, often, I will say often as a member of the disability community, especially growing up, a lot of people would say, you know, well, it's your job to educate, right? And if you educate people about how to treat blind folks, then the society will be better and we'll be treated better and we will have more equality, etc. And it was a really well-intended, I'm using disability because that is the authentic experience that I come from, but I think it can map onto lots of things. And that's a really well-intended idea, right? That the more education, the better it's going to be for you and for everyone else. But there was a key ingredient that was missing. And I often would get asked by other people with disabilities, you know, so what does it mean? How do we make people less uncomfortable around us? And I always say to people, well, the only way to do that is to show up as who you are. But ultimately, my comfort is something that I have to choose to expand, right? So if I think about this around dismantling or alleviating white supremacy, well, I've got to learn to get comfortable with things that I was not necessarily assumed to be comfortable with, right? I have to be invested in unlearning so that I can learn and relearn, right? Because I could sit through all of the DEI seminars and I could read all of the books and I could have all of the book conversations and I could do all the things. But if I'm not actually invested in it personally, if it's only in my seichel, only in my intellect, then I'm only for myself. I can think, well, look at all this great work I've done. I'm showing up here and I'm doing this and I'm doing that. But does that actually mean that there's any material change? Or do I just feel better because I've just acquired all of this knowledge that's now sitting in my brain and I will use it, in all the conversations that I can, but I don't actually move anywhere physically, right? And that's why I think those community conversations are really important, because if everyone is invested in education and in doing so through asking questions and relating one's experience to the work, because this is all personal work. This is not an abstract thing, this is deeply personal. What does it mean to be for others and to be for oneself? Then I think we can get there. And I think it's actually really important, because I will also say that there is a real need, I think, for people who are not part of the marginalized group. So we've been thinking a lot about racial justice, but I'll talk again about disability justice because that's the place that I can come from most authentically. When we think about how to, especially, COVID has had an incredible, and I mean that in the most negative way possible, an incredible effect on the disability community. And I'm also saying the disability community is a little bit of a misnomer because it's actually not a single umbrella, but for the sake of language, we'll just use that term right now. It has been incredibly negative. And what we need, and this is as true of racial justice work as well, what we desperately need is for people to not only be for themselves, but to be for others. And to get there might require coming together in like-minded groups, asking hard questions, and getting the information and the education needed with the investment so that you can go out there and really show up in a community of caring and do so in a way that's really genuine and not in a way that is only about looking or performing a particular way. And I think that as spiritual folks and as Jews and others and as people interested in building and growing our sense of ethics and morality, we have to just be very cautious to not fall into the reformative trap. And I think that is ultimately what our Mishnah is guarding against as well.
Judith, I see.
Yeah, I'm struck by Nilda and Rabbi Tuchman just now, and two things hit me. One is that Hillel put this part about if I'm not for myself first before talking about others, and we are usually brought up not to do that. We're usually brought up somehow to think about others first. And what you both were saying hit me about risk taking. I don't know how they're connected, but they're connected. There's something that if we don't do what Nilda's saying about talking in community, and what we have many communities we all belong to, and that we don't risk making mistakes, then we never move forward. So part of all of this is not that we have to say it perfectly, but we just have to say it and trust that the community will hold us. And I'm a teacher, so I find that with graduate students that they correct me very often. And I think that there's a blessing in that because I learn how to teach and learn, and they learn how to teach and learn. That there's just something I'm taking away from this about the risk taking, that it's added a new dimension for me in the Hillel piece.
Judith, I love that. And I'm so glad you brought that up because that was a piece that I neglected to say before, the risk taking. And particularly, I'm imagining with graduate students, it was not so long ago that I myself was a graduate student and rabbinical student. So I remember those days quite well. And if there's any indication, it's all the more so even now that it was when I was in school, which is not that long ago. But all humor aside, the key thing in what you just said is the risk taking and believing that the community will hold you, right? I think that part is the ikar. If we don't think the community is going to hold us, then we're not going to take any risks at all. And the only thing that's going to happen is things are just going to get worse. And I think that that's already beginning to happen because people are so, and I'm not even making any kind of political statement right now. I'm simply saying factually, I think people are really afraid, really, really, really afraid, and have had experiences that back that fear up, that doesn't come from nowhere, unfortunately. So when I notice in myself the desire to correct, which I do a lot, right? I notice it arising. I'm like, oh, I really want to correct that person. That was the, this term is better than that. Like, so what do I actually want here? Am I wanting to correct them, or what is the thing beneath that is driving that? It's almost like an automatic reflex, right? It's kind of like the emotional, when you have, how like we have physical reflexes, of course, it almost feels like an emotional reflex, right? And it's like, well, what actually is happening? That's what we have to start asking ourselves. And we have to build the muscle, the emotional muscle, and the speed of trust muscle. Everything moves at the speed of trust, right? To say, like, we're going to hold each other through these things, and we're all learning, and we're all growing, and we're all going to err. But our tradition gives us an ability to acknowledge that, do tshuva, and be able to return again and again and again. And so with that in mind, we're going to now be moving to closing. Unfortunately, I wish we had more time. This is such a juicy discussion. But with all of that in mind, that is what our mission is really asking us for. How do we find that path between, if I'm only for myself, who am I? And if I'm not for myself at all, who am I? How do we build a community that can hold us all in that? And so with that, I want to thank all of you so much for learning with me tonight. And it's just been such an honor and a bracha. I'm now going to turn it back over to Dave for a few closing announcements.
Great. Really, thank you so much, Lauren, for sharing such wonderful Torah with us tonight and helping us kick off this journey that we're going on, as Felicia mentioned at the beginning of our time together tonight. This is part of a much larger initiative at BJ, leading us through these 6 weeks towards Shavuot. We're starting on the second week of the Omer, but through an intentional study of Pirkei Avot with guiding questions along the way to ultimately lead us towards the creation of BJ's community covenant, wrestling with these questions about our relationship to one another, our communal obligations. And there are a few parts of this project that I just want to highlight quickly right now. First, this is this Tuesday night series. It's a 6-part series. Every night we'll be doing a different theme from a different Mishnah of the next chapter. So I want to just make sure everyone who's with us tonight is able to join us for the rest of the series. Next week, we're learning with Rabbi Noah Kushner from the Kitchen in San Francisco. After that, Rabbi Shmuley Yanklowitz from Valley Beit Midrash. After that, Rabbi Josh Feigelstein from the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, then Dr. Marjorie Lehman from Jewish Theological Seminary, and finally Dina Weiss from Hadar. That's the same time every week on Tuesday evenings, 7:15, right after our evening minyan. And the next piece I wanted to share is if you feel like you're looking for more on this Mishnah and looking to explore deeper, we were excited to share Sinai Bound, a reflective guide for Pirkei Avot. So each of these Mishnayot that we're exploring each week, there are resources and texts and poetry and questions to explore. This is available on our website. I'm going to throw a link in the chat in a moment. But also, if you come for Shabbat services or in-person minyan in the coming weeks, you'll be able to pick up a hard copy right at BJ. And the final piece I want to share, which was launched today, you may have got it in your inbox, just for BJ members, which I think is most of the folks here in the Zoom tonight. We want to hear your voice. We want to hear how these ideas are sitting with you and what your dreams are for how they may play out in the BJ community as we create this community covenant. So we've built on our website a virtual community journal where every week there's going to be a new prompt offered, and you can share a video, an audio, written text, however it is you want to share. We want to hear from your experience and your voice, and have that help shape the ultimate brief, the ultimate community covenant that we develop. So I'm putting in the chat right now the link for that virtual community journal. Even if you don't want to go there right now, click it now so it's open on your browser so you have it. But for whatever might still be sitting with you from tonight's learning, we invite you to go there and share some of what's on your mind and on your heart. And as we go on this journey together towards Shavuot. Again, I want to express a lot of gratitude to Rabbi Lauren Tuchman for helping us kick off this initiative tonight. And before we conclude, we want to take advantage of being together so late in the evening, and we can actually count the Omer together. So if you happen to have a Siddur with you, Siddur Sim Shalom, if Siddur Sim Shalom is the one that you have, it's on page 237. Page 237 in Siddur Sim Shalom, and we're counting tonight the 11th day of the Omer. הנני מוכן ומזומן לקיים מצוות עשה של ספירת העומר, כמו שכתוב בתורה, וספרתם לכם ממחרת השבת, מיום הביאכם את העומר התנופה, 7 שבתות תמימות תהיינה, עד ממחרת השבת השביעית תספרו 50 יום. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר קידשנו במצוותיו וציוונו על ספירת העומר. היום 11 יום שהם שבוע אחד ו4 ימים לעומר.